Hello, everybody. Hope you're going to have a wonderful evening. It's middle of the day here in Burgundy. It's a beautiful day with blue sky, a cold wind, starting to have fires in the evening. But it's a great weather in which to be drinking good wine. Sadly, I'm not joining you with the wines today in person, but they're almost all wines which I've tasted myself and quite recently. And what I'm hoping to be able to do is tell you a little bit about Burgundy, my ideas about Burgundy, and some background information. What the wines actually taste like is much more down to you guys. You've got them in the glasses in front of you, so you can make your own minds up. And some of you will like one wine and some of you will like another wine. It doesn't matter. It's always better if the pleasure gets spread around the room and around different glasses. So when I started out actually as a wine merchant rather than as a wine writer or critic, I knew I was going to work with French wines, but I didn't know exactly where from. And I went round France in 1981 in all the different regions. And the one I fell in love with there and then, and even more so since, was Burgundy, because not only were the wines wonderful, but the guys making them were just so enthusiastic about what they were doing and so keen to make the best wine that they could and to discuss the difference between this small plot here and that small plot there. It's an unbelievably complex region, even though, broadly speaking, you're really only dealing with one grape variety in white, which is evidently Chardonnay, and one in red, the famous Pinot Noir. But the subtleties of difference between one side of the room and the other side of the room, as it might be, are amazing. So as you'll know, the vineyards get classified according to their potential brilliance. It doesn't guarantee that every wine from a top classification will be good, because it's perfectly possible that somebody isn't really up to standard in making it. But what it does tell you is that a Grand Cru has the potential to be an even greater wine than a Premier Cru, and a Premier Cru is more interesting than something which is at the village level. So tonight we've got a couple of village wines. We have got, I think, 4 Premier Cru wines and then a Grand Cru to finish. They're all good vintages, and some of them will be a little bit young, but it's really, really hard to get fully mature wine these days. But all of them should be open for enjoyment, even while young. So the best whites, of course, come from the southern part of the main Burgundy region, the Côte d'Or, the bit called the Côte de Beaune, and we've got 2 whites, and then 5 reds, which are all from the northern part, the Côte de Nuit, which is most people's favorite for the top reds. You can probably consider 3 great villages to make wine for the whites, which are Chassagne Montrachet, Puligny Montrachet, and Meursault, though some would say that Saint-Aubin has come up to join them. And what we've got with our first 2 wines is a Chassagne and a Puligny. So they're almost all the villages we've got tonight are double-barreled, because in the 19th century, somebody had the bright idea, initially in Gevrey Chambertin, that in order to do a little bit of rudimentary marketing, let's hyphenate, let's add the name of our best vineyard, which in the case of the 2 whites is Montrachet. So first of all Puligny and then Chassagne, but in the same year, 1879, they applied to be allowed to add this word Montrachet. It's a small vineyard, it's 8 hectares, 20 acres, but it does make the most glorious wine, white wine of Burgundy, possibly of the world. And it always has done, ever since anybody first wrote books about Burgundy. The first one we really know of is 1728. It still gets mentioned as being quintessentially much more exciting than anything else that was around. So these are 2 small villages which are either side of a main road, and if you're in the family of one village, you're not allowed to cross the road to marry somebody from the other village. Otherwise you get kicked out of your initial home. Very old-fashioned in that respect. And our first wine is going to be at the village level. So it's not a Premier Cru or Grand Cru, but it is from a single named vineyard, which is called Le Concis des Champs. It doesn't really mean anything much, but champ is a French word for field. from a producer called Domaine Hubert Lamy. The Lamys have been around for a long time, and that's a theme that we're going to see regularly, because Burgundy is very much a farming community, and so you get the same families who marry each other, sometimes seem to marry themselves, but it's all a very, very tight-knit community. And often the person who really put the estate, the domain, on the map continues to have the domain named after him. In fact, though Hubert Lamy is still alive and well, he's been retired for quite a while, 20 plus years, and it's his son Olivier who has really made these wines exciting. He's a fanatic in the vineyard. We like to say that most of the wines, the success of the wines, come from the vineyards. Growing your grapes is absolutely essential. And if you've got beautiful grapes coming in, then you have a much better chance of doing the right thing in your winery and ending up with a great wine. So Olivier Lamy, his grapes seem to ripen before other people's, but they have all the sugar you want, but especially all the concentration of flavor. I'm assuming that you have it served. Let me know if not. And do interrupt me if you have particular questions you want to ask. Otherwise, I think we'll have time for a little bit of a question and answer session at the end. So this is a vineyard, as was the case with a lot of Chassagne Montrachet, which used to be red wines, used to be grown with Pinot. And then in 2005, Olivier Lamy decided to replant it with Chardonnay, because he thinks Chardonnay is more successful for most parts of Chassagne. So these are younger vines than most of the wines we'll be having. They were just 14 years old at the time of the 2019 harvest. We tend not to ask too many questions about white wine making, which is a shame, because it's actually just as important as red wine making. But the key points here is that Olivier doesn't like to use much in the way of new wood. He doesn't want the flavor of new wood. He wants the wine to dominate. And he likes to crush the grapes, which is now rare in Burgundy, before he presses them. So if you do that, you get a little bit more of the skin, which is where a lot of the flavor is, the effect of the skin in your wine. So that's what he does. And though he doesn't use new oak, he uses slightly bigger wood than most people do, and he keeps the wine in barrel for longer. So this 2019 would probably not have been bottled until the spring or summer of 2021. And 2019 is a lovely, luscious, very easily accessible vintage that's pleasing everybody everywhere. And because of that slightly luscious aspect to it, then I think it's a wine that you can drink quite young. There's probably still, you're tasting the wine, not me, but there's probably still a little bit of austerity, because Olivier wants to make a wine that will last a long time. So you probably get that on the palate, but the fruit that you initially find should be very attractive. And these days, to keep the wine fresh and to avoid any cork taint, he uses the artificial diam closures rather than traditional corks. Should be the case for that wine. So there are a few thoughts, a bit of background. It's, in a sense, the junior wine of the tasting to kick off, but it is made by somebody who really knows what he's doing and is a bit of a guru to the younger generation coming up behind him. If you have the other white wine alongside, I can talk about that. So we have got a wine that's 2 years older and is a Premier Cru from Puligny Montrachet. So it is higher in status, will probably be higher in price, from Mr. Francois Carillon. And the Carillons have been around for the longest time. They go back at least to 1611, so that's over 400 years now, and probably earlier than that. But they can trace reference to a winemaking Carillon back in 1611. The wines of Puligny Montrachet are supposed to be a little bit more characterful than Chassagne Montrachet. They're supposed to be more floral in their bouquet, and then have a very good backbone based on acidity. though in recent years the acidity levels are lower as the weather is warmer. And this vineyard Perrières sounds as though it means stony, because Pierre being French for stone. But actually, back in many hundreds of years ago, it was the name used to mean a stone quarry. So in this vineyard, they dug out the stone in order to build the houses of Puligny Montrachet. So all these villages are 1,000 years old plus. And the vineyards have been planted in one form or another for at least that time, probably longer, anything up to 2,000 years. But it's only in the last couple of hundred years that we've started getting interested in the characteristic of one vineyard as opposed to another. So when I last tasted this, which was just over a year ago, I felt that it was maturing reasonably, not fast in a negative sense, but it was just coming forward and getting itself ready to drink. And the 2017s have proved to be a little bit richer than we thought right at the outset. So it should be in a good place now. I think you get a lot of ripeness in the fruit, but there should be very good energy levels to balance that. And it's probably going to deliver more detail in future years, but it's probably pretty much ready as from now. So those are our two Burgundy Chardonnays to kick off the occasion. As I say, theoretically, the second wine is the grander of the two. Francois Carillon has made a very good reputation for himself as a slightly more modern style of winemaker. You'll also find his brother. They worked together in the family domain until 2010, and then the two brothers separated amicably. You know, there's not a big fight. But the other, Carillon, Jacques Carillon, makes a slightly more old-fashioned wine, which tends not to be ready to drink very early, but can be good when it is ready. One thing I would say, excuse me, one thing I would say about white wines of Burgundy is that I wouldn't serve them too cold. Most places in the world tend to serve their white wines chilled and their red wines a little too warm. And in the case of Burgundy, I think it's better to have the temperatures of the two wines relatively close. So I serve my red Burgundy a little bit cooler than most people would, or I would with most other regions. And I serve my white Burgundy just a little bit warmer, where, you know, without the chill on it. So I have no idea what temperature you have at the moment, but I'm sure it'll be interesting if you leave some wine in the glass and come back to it later on, if it warms up a bit. I think you'll find more individual detail in both of those wines, more character. But everybody has their own view. And I do remember doing a tasting. I went for a day to Korea to do a tasting for a wine group there, and commissioned to do it. And I was mostly red Burgundy, but I served one white Burgundy. And somebody said to me, Mr. Morris, don't you understand that in our market, we don't like white wines much, and not from Burgundy. You know, I'm a bit disappointed that you've wasted actually, we had two white wines. Yeah, you sort of wasted a couple of choices on white. And then when I served the wines, I served them the temperature which I like, that little bit warmer. And they said, Mr. Morris, we thought you were the expert and you allowed the wines to be served too warm. And I said, no, this is the right temperature for this sort of white wine. And then at the end of the evening, I asked people to write down on a piece of paper what their favorite wines were. And guess what? Their two favorite wines were the two white wines. And they had enjoyed the reds. So there's an awful lot of work on that to be done, I think, all around the world. And even smart restaurants, even in France, I think often serve the whites a bit too cold. All right. I shall have a sip of my Oriental Beauty tea.
Jasper, interestingly, actually, the Carillon was served a little bit warmer than the first one. So I think the group can't tell the difference. It's a little bit more and with more complexity, I think. At least that's my view. So.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for the feedback. Right. Well, as I say, you can go on sniffing at those and enjoying them as the evening goes on. But we have a few wines to get through, and if you're ready, I will start talking about the red wines. Just to preface, so this grape Pinot Noir, we know with the whites that Chardonnay, it works everywhere in the world. I mean, there's barely a country that grows wine that hasn't got Chardonnay planted. But Pinot Noir is a much trickier grape to grow because it has a thinner skin than other red grapes, which means it can get sunburned and it won't tolerate hot areas. So most of Australia doesn't work, just a couple of cooler places. New Zealand does work. Oregon more than California, though there are some cooler spots in California, that works. But Burgundy remains the absolute home of Pinot Noir. And though Chardonnay is a relatively recent grape, we don't know exactly when it happened, but probably within the last 200 to 300 years, it evolved. We know that Pinot Noir has existed ever since they first put a name to a grape, which was in the 1300s. Duke Philip of Burgundy put out an edict saying, I won't have any other grape, particularly not Gamay, planted in my Burgundy vineyards. Has to be Pinot Noir. So it's got the history, it's got the pedigree, and we're beginning to find a few examples which are all right in various other parts of the world, but it really has got to be exactly the right place and the smart people making it. So personally, I also love the wines, the red wines you find in the Côte de Beaune from villages such as Volnay and Pommard and Beaune itself. But most people think that the concentration of excellence is just north of Beaune in what they call the Côte de Nuit, which starts at Dijon, a couple of minor villages, and then the core villages are Gevrey-Chambertin, Moret-Saint-Denis, Chambon-Musigny, Vougeot, Vosne-Romanee, and Nuit-Saint-Georges itself. Almost all of them double-barreled names because they have taken the name of their best vineyard. And the first to do that was Gevrey-Chambertin, when Gevrey en montagne, Gevrey in the hills, as it was called, became Gevrey-Chambertin. And what we have here are three Gevrey-Chambertins before we have two other wines from Vosne-Romanee. But these three Gevrey-Chambertins, we begin with a village wine, but from a very special vineyard, and we then go to two Premier Crus. So first up, we have a village wine from Les Evocelles. Now, about the classification, the rules were laid down in 1935 when they elected a few vineyards to be Grand Crus, and the rest were just names of vineyards within a village. And shortly after that, they said, but the best vineyards which haven't quite qualified as Grand Crus shall be called Premier Crus. So that got enacted about 6 or 7 years later. But sometimes you find a village vineyard which you think on another day that could have been, perhaps should have been, a Premier Cru. So that's where we are with Les Evocelles. And it's towards the north of the village. Everything immediately south of this vineyard is a Premier Cru. And then Evocelles is the first, which isn't. And I think it's I think maybe it could have been. So our grower is called Dugat-PY. So there's a family called Dugat who are well known in Gevrey-Chambertin, been around for many generations. And at some point, I think the generation prior to this one, Mrs. Dugat, the wife, gets her name attached. So Mr. Dugat married a Miss Mademoiselle P, and the domain became domain Dugat-PY. And it was Bernard Dugat, recently retired, who really put it on the map, and his son Loic, who's taken over and doing a great job, similar way to the Lamys. Now, when we come to this, all the red wines, there is one key element of vinification which I think makes a difference, and that is whether, having picked your grapes, you pick up the bunch of grapes, all the grapes, and you put the whole lot into the fermenting vat. So you've got not just the fruit itself, but also the physical part of the bunch, i.e. the stems. Or you put it through a destemming machine and you just end up with the berries themselves, and you ferment without the stems. And it's a big argument. I mean, if we were to take some of the most famous names, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and Domaine Le Roi are fans of keeping the bunches whole and using the stems, but the late great Henri Jaillet said absolutely no to stems. He said, just think, here's a grape stem, pick it up, put it in your mouth, bite on that. It's a horrible flavor. Do you really want to have that in your wine? So that was his point of view. But other great names like Madame Leroy and Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, they say, no, we like the stems. And actually, I like the stems too. And in this instance, Dugat-PY are quite fans. They don't go the whole hog. They don't make everything whole clusters. But this wine we have is 60% whole clusters, and they like to use a lot of new wood. So it's 75% new wood, 3 barrels out of 4. They have quite a lot of land in Gevrey Chambertin at the village level, but that gets blended together with the exception of this Les Evocelles, which they prefer to make apart because they think it has that little bit of extra quality. It's high on the hill, east facing, gets the early morning sun. One of the great characteristics and skills of this domain is that they have really, really good plant material. We think of Pinot Noir as being just one grape, and in a sense it is, but there are lots of either clones or subspecies before clones existed of Pinot Noir, which can either give you big berries with lots of juice and thin skins and fairly ordinary taste, but plenty of juice to make a lot of wine, or you can get very small bunches with small berries. You've got a big concentration, a big ratio of the skin where all the flavor is to the juice. And that's what the Dugat family have. And they've kept these grapes, this vine genotype, going in their own family vineyards over the successive generations. I think we're currently talking about the 10th or 11th generation of Dugat in the village. And that really makes a difference. So normally, if you get a wine which is quite dark in color and quite intense, it's probably somebody who has picked the grapes quite late to make sure they're fully ripe. But in their case, they can pick them early because they've got such good Pinot fruit material that they get everything they want early on. So they avoid having wines of too high sugar levels when they're mature. So when I tasted this in barrel in 2018 and gave it a very high rating, I do something that's a little bit different to most critics, because nowadays most critics like to score the wines out of 100 points, which I also do because the market demands it. But I also have a star system alongside. And the reason for doing that is if you have an inexpensive wine from a basic appellation, so as it might be a straight Bourgogne Rouge or a very simple Bordeaux, and it's very good of its type, it's still only going to get a score in the high 80s, and that 88 points will be ignored. But if 88 points is the very best that that vineyard could produce, then it's worth 5 stars. Equally, if you have a Grand Cru, something called Chambertin or Musigny or in white Montrachet, if it gets 88 points, that's a really poor score for that wine, and it only deserves 1 or 2 stars. So 3 stars means these wines are good for what they do. And as it happens, I gave both the 2 whites 3 stars. The next 2 reds I gave 4-star ratings to. I haven't tasted, or at least rated, the third Gevrey Chambertin from Mr. Roty. But the last 2 wines, they were both in my very top category of 5 stars. So well done, Jeff, or whoever put the wine selection together, because I only give about 5% of all wines get into the 5-star category. And that means I'm really excited. So here we've got a 4-star, which means it's a definite buy from Dugat-PY. 2017 in red was a big crop, which used to be something to worry about in the further back past, because it used to mean that the grapes probably wouldn't ripen. But now with global warming, we find that the grapes can ripen with a slightly bigger yield. It means it's not the most concentrated of vintages. So these are not mythical wines in 2017, which will be around in 25 or 50 years' time. But on the other hand, it means that they're absolute beauties to drink now. Though both are two 2017 producers here from Gevrey, Dugat-PY and Denis Mortet, they both make wines capable of long aging. So they're only at the beginning, I suspect, of their aging potential. And assuming you have it, it would be good to taste the next wine, because it comes from a Premier Cru vineyard, but it's very close by Evocelles. So it's almost the next vineyard. In fact, I think it is the next vineyard, or next but one vineyard to Evocelles, but it's fortunate that it made it into the classification of Premier Cru when Evocelles didn't. So Domaine Denis Mortet, the domain was really started by Denis' father, Charles. Then Denis took over in 1993, had an immediate success, really great wines in his first vintage to put him on the map. He sadly died young in 2005, and after that it's his son, Arnaud, who has taken over. And Arnaud has very much continued in the same mould. Like Dugat-PY, they're quite dark-coloured wines. There's a school of that within Gevrey Chambertin, good producers who seem to end up with darker wine, both in colour and in the fruit profile. But again, he picks reasonably early, and it's a tribute to the quality of the Pinot Noir vines he's got and the quality of his unbelievably meticulous work in the vines that means that the grapes are ripe early, and I think they make stunning wines. And I adored this when I tasted it in barrel in December 2018. He also uses a certain amount of whole clusters, i.e. the stems. That's reasonably new at the domain, but in the hotter years he started to do it. And in this wine, it's about 40% stems. What difference do the stems make? They tend to make the wine a little bit livelier. They change the aromatics. You sometimes get a feeling of white pepper in there, which you wouldn't get in a fully destemmed wine. I did a fascinating tasting one year at the Hong Kong Wine Club, where their system of doing it is they have a dozen wines. You let them taste for half an hour without saying anything. They are expected to order the wines 1 to 12. You're not allowed anything joint equal, but they've got to say 1, that's my favorite wine, down to 12, my least favorite, all in the space of half an hour. And then we go through the wines and discuss them, and somebody adds up the scores and sees what the favorite was. But I also said, out of the 12 wines I brought you, 4 of them are made entirely 100% with the stems. 4 of them are made using some stems, but not a majority. And 4 of them are made without any stems at all. And I want you also to vote on each wine whether you think it's with all stems, some stems, or no stems. And the fascinating thing there was the first 6 wines tasted chronologically, everybody got them right. And the next 6 wines, as their palates got a bit more fatigued, people didn't get them right anymore. So it's really quite a mixed bag, but it was very interesting. But some people came away from that tasting saying, I thought I didn't like stems, but I find that I do. Gevrey Chambertin is supposed to be one of the most powerful of the appellations of the villages in Burgundy. And it has this sort of name as being the king of wines, the wine of kings, le roi des vins, le vin des rois, which is all a bit tedious. But actually, I think Gevrey Chambertin works very well if you don't try and force the issue and you don't try and make too powerful a wine. Okay, shall I talk a little bit about the third while you taste them?
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay, so the third comes from a domain called Joseph Roty. He is no longer with us. He was a man who lived life to the full, to the extent that the first time I went and tasted there, I was told to come at 6 o'clock in the evening, which I did. And I eventually got out of there at around 1 o'clock in the morning. So it was a 7-hour tasting. You know, he stopped in the middle and took us to a local restaurant, gave us some food to help soak it up. And then we went back and tried all the bottles. So he was a man who really did live life a little bit extremely. and unfortunately, it meant that he didn't live to ripe old age. And his first son, Philippe, suddenly, unfortunately, got very ill with the cancer, and so it's the younger son, Pierre-Jean, who's taken over. But it's very much a family domain. When I go and taste there, his mother will pop her head round the door and bring a few little cheese biscuits to nibble at. His sister will appear for a bit. All the family are working out in the vineyards or in the winery. And he makes wines which are really, really, really meant for long-term aging. They're very dense, concentrated wines. Fontenys will probably have 50% of new oak, so 1 barrel in 2. Everything is destemmed, unlike the first 2 wines, so none of the stems in there at all. And I find the wines have such a density of fruit when I go and taste the young wines, that it's really hard to imagine drinking them for quite a long time afterwards. In this case, we've got 2015, which is a magnificent vintage in Burgundy, hugely concentrated, but in a very glossy style that makes it possible to approach young. But my guess that this Fontenys, which is next to the Grand Crus, is a wine that's going to need still quite a lot more time. I think it will be more concentrated, more intense than the 2 2017s, but maybe not quite so accessible. So those are my thoughts on it. It's not a wine. I didn't start tasting the young wines at the winery until the 2017 vintage, so I don't have a barrel note on this particular wine. If we sort of travel slowly down the Côte de Nuit while waiting for the next 2 wines to be poured, after Gevrey Chambertin, your next village is Morey-Saint-Denis, and the one after is Chambeaux-Musigny. And Chambeaux is all about elegance, and Gevrey Chambertin is all about structure. And so in between the 2, you have Morey-Saint-Denis, where I think you can get some glorious wines, which are quite good value because Morey doesn't have quite the same reputation. But it sort of combines a bit of both the villages on either side. So it has a little bit of the elegance of Chambeaux-Musigny, and it has the structure of Gevrey Chambertin. So it's a very small village, and each of the individual vineyards is small. So you don't have the advantage in the marketplace of seeing lots of them around. But it includes a few Grand Crus, Clos de la Roche and Clos Saint-Denis, who are owned by lots of different people. They all have slices. And Clos de Lombre and Clos de Tar, which are more or less monopolies. So you only have one, and they're big rivals, those 2. So I think it's an interesting village to look at for under the radar value, and a lot of good producers in that village. Chambeaux-Musigny did its usual thing of hyphenating its favorite vineyard, Musigny, which is unquestionably the best. There are 2 Grand Crus in Chambeaux, Musigny itself and Bonnes-Mares, and there's a 3rd vineyard which sells at the same price as Bonnes-Mares, and it's only a Premier Cru in the official classification, but everybody thinks of it as being worth a Grand Cru, which is Les Amoureuses, Chambeaux-Musigny Les Amoureuses. It's probably true, though, that Chambeaux-Musigny is a little bit at risk with global warming, because it's a village where the vineyards tend to ripen quite early, and that can be a danger in the hotter years. It's not all the producers, not all the vineyards, but it's something that needs to be addressed in the coming years. After that, you have a village called Vougeot, which really only has one vineyard of note, which is called Clos Vougeot, has the immense stone building, the Chateau De Clovisio, which was built 700 years ago by the monks, and the monks of Burgundy. That's where they made their wine, in that extraordinary building, and it's become a little bit of a center for this part of Burgundy. And then you have Vosne Romanee, the appellation Vosne Romanee, which actually covers 2 villages, 2 communes, Vosne itself, and next door there's just the wrong side of the railway line, there is a commune called Echezeaux, but it also has vineyards which are up on the main hillside slope. And they are, unless it's Grand Cru Echezeaux, which is the wine we're going to finish on, then any other wine from that commune sells itself under the banner of Vosne Romanee. And curiously, this one, the Premier Cru Les Beaux, which is our next wine, is actually partly in Vosne Romanee and partly in Flèche Echezeaux. And the main Grivot, Jean Grivot, who have a big holding, nearly a hectare, have it split between the two. They have lots of Premier Crus in Vosne Romanee, but this is my favorite. There are others which have more official fame in the marketplace, like Les Souchaux and Les Regnault and Les Brûlés, but Beaumont is the one which I like best. It's a domain I've come to know very well. Jean Grivot and his wife are amongst the senior citizens of Vosne Romanee. They were born in 1928 and 1925, respectively. Their son, Etienne, took over in the late 1980s, and he is just now handing over to his daughter, Mathilde, well, his children, Mathilde and Hubert, but it's largely his daughter, Mathilde, the elder of the two, who is taking on the mantle as winemaker in this domain, Jean Grivot. They've gone through a lot of changes in style over the years, but I think by during the 2000s and coming into the 2010s, they pretty much fixed the style that they really wanted to continue with, and it's been a little bit of tweaking ever since. So like Roty, these are people who don't like to use any of the whole clusters, no stems at all. Everything is destemmed. They pick a little bit later to go for what they think of as optimum ripeness. And they keep the wines in barrel for about 18 months before sending them to tank and then bottling them. So they also have 3 Grand Crus, Echezeaux, Clovisio, and Richebourg, which is very much up at the top of the tree. So this to me is one of the exciting domains in Vosne Romanee, which has an awful lot of exciting domains. Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, Domaine Leroy, Domaine de Compligé-Belair, Meilloux-Camisay, Catillard, Grivot, and there are probably half an others, Minoret-Gibourg, Charras-Minoret, La Marche. You've probably got 15 or 20 domains who are making exciting wines at the moment. And that's very encouraging, because it would be very easy for Burgundy to have got complacent and to start thinking that because it's Burgundy, the wine must be good. And that was sort of how they felt when I came into this business in the early 1980s, when in fact the wines were not good. Now they're way better, but everybody is keen to go on improving and doing the best that they can. So that is your first of the two. And when I last tasted it, which was in September of 2018, in fact was a blind tasting rather than, which is sometimes more difficult to give wines really high scores. I gave this 97 points and 5 stars as a Premier Cru. I thought it was very, very exciting. I thought the fruit and the oak had been extremely well integrated. It was a dark cherry fruit, and it was really, really long finish. So it'd be interesting to see how that's showing today. Hope you have that in your glasses. So now this wine is going to be different in a number of grounds. One is it's a Grand Cru from Echezeaux. Another point is that it's 2018. Now that was the first of the sort of new look vintages of being really hot and dry. 2018, 19, 20, and then 2022 fall into this pattern. Nothing very much before that, apart from 2003 was an outlier. But now it's the norm. It wasn't true of 2021, but otherwise everything from 2018 onwards has been hotter and drier and richer, and often slightly more alcohol. So this one is the only wine which is probably going to be ahead, higher in alcohol than 14%. It will probably say 14 or maybe 14.5% on the label. But I thought it was a very good wine indeed, silky and sensual. He's got a big holding of Echezeaux in several different plots, and he's able to blend them together to get a very rounded wine. This also is destemmed, also 18 months in barrel, about 2/3 new wood. And you'll see that this domain has 3 names: Coquard-Loison-Fleurot. The Coquards come from the village of Moray-Saint-Denis and have brought some vineyards from there. The Loisons come from Flagey-Echezeaux and would have been the owners of this Echezeaux. And then the Fleurot, they also married into our local sort of grain cereal farmers rather than wine people. And there's actually a 4th name because the current winemaker is called Thomas Collardeau. So I think either one of the Coquards or the Fleurots married a Monsieur Collardeau, who's actually mayor of the village. So this was a domain that used to make really ordinary wines in big volumes, and they didn't even bother to bottle them themselves. They sold them off in bulk. And then starting with Thomas Collardeau, his best mate is somebody called Sébastien Catillard, and Domaine Catillard in Vosne was making beautiful wines. And Thomas Collardeau is starting to make wines in very much the same style. So he's one of the later people to pick, and the grapes are all destemmed. So ostensibly, the wines are similar in style to the Grivot wines, but everybody puts their own little pattern into the winemaking. I found this really smooth and silky, sensual when I tasted it from barrel. Haven't tasted it since the barrel. So what Vosne Romanee and with it Echezeaux are supposed to deliver to us is a most superb intensity, but also with a class of fruit, a really stylish style of fruit, velvety, which puts them just that little touch above any of the other villages in most people's impression. Well, I hope you've enjoyed them. I hope drink a lot more Burgundy and enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you very much for your company.
Thank you, Jasper.
Bye-bye.